Sorry, I was chatting with somebody in the room here. Didn't mean to confuse. Good evening to those in India, and good morning to those joining from the United States. My name is David Rams, and I am the U.S. Consul General here in Mumbai. It is my very great pleasure to be here with you tonight, or this morning. On October 27th, on the eve of COP26, we met to talk about what we and business organizations generally anticipated and hoped would be coming. Today's discussion is entitled Post-COP26, Opportunities for U.S.-India Collaboration on Sustainability. COP26 in Glasgow accelerated international progress on climate action through diplomacy in a variety of ways. Let me walk you through a few highlights of what the United States specifically achieved and announced. We reached an agreement with more than 100 countries, representing 85% of the world's forests, to stop deforestation by 2030. We released the United States' long-term strategy, which outlines how we'll get to a net zero economy by 2050. We developed the U.S. Methane Emissions Reduction Action Plan, which includes robust new rules to reduce emissions, cut consumer costs, and support job growth. We announced that more than 100 governments, including some of the world's biggest emitters, have joined the Global Methane Pledge, one central aim of which is to cut down emissions of this gas by 30% of 2020 figures by 2030. We created partnerships to drive innovation and new technology. And we established the President's Emergency Plan for Adaptation and Resilience to support climate adaptation efforts for more than 500 million people worldwide. At COP26, President Biden also restated his goal for the U.S. to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. India committed to achieving the same goal by 2070. Of particular interest to those assembled today, the United States welcomes the opportunity to work with India in achieving its COP26 announced target of generating 500 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2030. Now, to meet these ambitious targets, we have to build on the momentum generated by COP26. Innovation, funding, and creativity are all critical for identifying and implementing new, realistic solutions. For companies to adopt clean technology, newer, affordable options must become available. And that's where you come in. These announcements and goals are tailor-made for ambitious and forward-thinking businesses to turn the vision into profitable opportunities. US and Indian companies can lead the way through collaboration and by capitalizing on our long and successful bilateral partnership. As just one example of how this partnership between our two countries is manifesting at the state level, the Maharashtra government and Rocky Mountain Institute, a well-established Colorado-based nonprofit working on clean energy transitions, signed a memorandum of understanding at COP26, which will support the adoption and broader use of electric vehicles throughout Maharashtra. And dialogues such as this one today, which we at the consulate are organizing and co-hosting, are another example. This year, our team organized several events to promote clean energy solutions. Our last three attracted a collective audience of 1,000 business owners and corporate representatives. In just the past 2 months, we organized a program to share best practices for manufacturing companies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, convened Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman, together with chairman of the Ananta Center and managing director of Godrej & Boyce Manufacturing, Jamshed Godrej, to discuss how to grow a green economy with renewable energy. And we held the first event of our COP26 series before the conference began to discuss how companies will have to collaborate globally on technology, infrastructure, and finance to stay ahead of the curve. A common suggestion by our expert panelists at these sessions has included the need for global public-private partnerships to achieve climate change goals. Today, we are here to understand what new business opportunities will arise with the US and India's collaboration on sustainability emerging from COP26. We are thrilled to have Dr. Irfan Nuruddin, the Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's South Asia Center and a professor in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, to lead today's discussion with our outstanding panelists. Dr. Nuruddin conducts research in the political economy of development, trade, and investment, and the challenges of democratization in the 21st century. You can find his full bio in the chat section below. Before I turn it over to Irfan, I would like to thank our partners, the Atlantic Council and CII, our panelists, and all of you joining us today. I look forward to a very informative and candid discussion that will help us all conceptualize how we individually and collectively can advance the goals of COP26. Thank you, and over to you, Irfan.
Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, and thank you so much for that warm welcome, Consul General. We appreciate your partnership and your leadership. On behalf of my colleagues at the South Asia Center at the Atlantic Council in Washington, DC, it is a real pleasure to welcome all of you to this conversation focused on the opportunities for US-India collaboration in the follow-up to COP26. To have this conversation, I've invited three friends, all leading experts in various aspects of the broader policy debates raging around the world, to participate in the conversation. We also invite each of you to share your questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Keep your questions to the point, and I'll do my best to incorporate them into our conversation. But without further ado, let me introduce to you our three panelists. I've put in the chat links to some resources for you, including to our partner, the Confederation of Indian Industry, and to each of the panelists' bios. Our first panelist in alphabetical order is Ms. Ketki Bhagwati. Ms. Bhagwati is a senior advisor to the South Asia Center. She is a board director of Axis Bank, advisor to KPMG India, and sits on other boards as well. Ketki had a very successful career at the International Finance Corporation before her current roles. Dr. Matthew McGuire is the former executive director for the World Bank representing the United States, post to which he was nominated by President Obama. Dr. McGuire has a long career in private equity, in finance, serves on a variety of boards, and brings to this conversation deep experience and expertise in global finance and cross-border financing of the kinds of things that are going to be required for the green transition. And finally, but by far not the least, Ms. Shloka Nath is the CEO of the India Climate Collaborative. She's also head of sustainability policy and strategy for Tata Trust, and has emerged over the last few years as a leading public intellectual shaping the debates and conversations around climate change and what India can do to prepare itself to be at the lead of the transition to a greener future. So Ketki, Matt, Shloka, thank you so much for taking the time this morning and this evening, and welcome. The conversation that occurred in Glasgow for some represented the last best hope for the planet to help itself prevent a pretty abysmal future as climate change heats the planet and creates pretty unimaginable futures for large communities around the world, in particular the most disadvantaged and marginalized communities. On the flip side, from an optimistic perspective, the very notion that 180 countries could be convinced to agree to a single document suggests that it's not impossible to forge the kinds of compromise and agreement that is going to be required for bold, innovative solutions to emerge. And if those bold, innovative solutions are to emerge anywhere, it is likely to be because of private sector innovation that drives technology adoption. Somewhere in a lab, somewhere around the world, scientists are working on breakthrough technologies that undoubtedly will make the world a better place going forward. In some sense, the debate then is how quickly can we get there? In some sense, I guess, will it be too late when we finally get there? But let's avoid that for right now. How quickly can we get there? And how equitable will that transition be? Can developing countries like India compete for the technologies, for the finance required? So with that as the broad agenda, and of course, hoping that you will take this conversation to heights that I can't even imagine, let's begin. I'd like to start with Shloka. Shloka, you as a public intellectual and through your work at ICC have been following the COP26. I would flag for the audience that the India Climate Collaborative has hosted a series of webinars, I think 5 altogether, focused on issues of direct interest to this audience on business impacts of COP26, and I urge you to check those out as well. But Shloka, from your perspective, what should the audience be thinking about the outcomes of COP26? What are the big takeaway points to frame the conversation?
Thank you, Irfan, for this very relevant question. And thank you, of course, for inviting me to be part of this very important panel. I think let's begin by talking about why this COP is so important. And you've sort of alluded to that in your comments as well. One of the reasons, of course, that it was such a critical event is because it was the first opportunity for countries since the Paris Agreement to enhance their NDCs with far more ambitious targets on climate action. And I think also what I want to point out is that the conference itself was held just 2 months after the IPCC 6th assessment report, which really spelled quite dire consequences and honestly a code red for humanity. So COP26 was therefore a really crucial platform to demand urgent and accelerated action, particularly in developed countries. And the theme this year, actually there were 4 themes this year that the COP focused on. It was mitigation, it was adaptation, finance, and collaboration. On the second day of COP26, India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi took the delegation by surprise, really, with a very ambitious and really a ramped up set of commitments on climate action in a very powerful speech. And he outlined 5 goals for India. And I won't go over each of those, but I think what's clear is that power generation took center stage in the announced targets. And so India's PM really continues to push and lead the world stage on renewables while safeguarding the carbon space to enable development objectives. And of course, finance is a big part of this. PM Modi has also called for $1 trillion a package from developed nations, which haven't really been able to deliver as yet on their $100 billion commitment. So that's obviously, I think, a big theme that came out of COP26 and will be one going forward, the finance piece. Another thing that's been made very apparent is that net zero is a core principle, and that's emerged very clearly. So this signal really demands decarbonization. It will impact the basis of competition amongst businesses in the current landscape. Net zero commitments made in Glasgow, came from coalitions of various stakeholders, including businesses, together with governments and financial institutions, multilateral organizations, to address systemic problems. So businesses do see a potential premium in sound net zero planning and execution. I think that's something that was very evident. There was also a slew of announcements that was made like never before. We did see the private sector and businesses come increasingly forward in those announcements. I think that's a big sort of differential from this COP actually compared to others. So for example, Glasgow's leaders prepared a deforestation declaration on forest and land use that committed for the first time really finance of public funds alongside private investment. And in that plan, you saw global leaders affirm the role of forests, for instance, in balancing greenhouse gas emissions and removals. They spoke to the need to adapt to the impacts of climate change and to maintain healthy ecosystem services. So this is really great momentum to build on, and we do need to ensure that these don't remain commitments, but are followed up with concrete action in line with what science demands and honestly what vulnerable communities need. Finally, what I do want to say is, companies should not wait to act. Most companies can make no regret moves even while drawing up their long-term agendas. So where we need to start is with straightforward moves that are sure to generate value, such as investing in energy efficiency, in renewable energy, investing in nature-based solutions. And I think one more thing I do want to sort of point out is that the COVID-19 pandemic seems to have initiated a paradigm shift towards businesses' sustainability, where ESG, you've got environment, social, and governance norms that have become really quite commonplace in parlance, at least. So even though the net zero target this year announced during COP26 seems far off on the horizon, businesses are already realizing climate change as a tangible risk. And the financial gains from mitigation are more evident than ever before. So that again is a movement that's gaining momentum. And I can talk about this a little bit more in detail later on in the conversation around sort of what Indian businesses and companies have signed up to, what are some of the sort of big movements that we're seeing in that space. But again, just to sort of end, I do want to say that the transition to a low carbon future is evident across top level management and boards of Indian companies. We've seen an EV boom in Indian automobile manufacturing. We've seen oil and gas companies entering the RE space. We've also seen investments in green hydrogen. So finally, I think the good news is that India has recognized the need for a sustainable low carbon development, and it isn't conditional on what other countries do. We have a commitment to our future and the future of our people, and it's critical for India to invest in low carbon growth because we are going to see emissions ramp up in coming decades if we don't act now. Thanks, Irfan. Back to you.
No, Shloka, that was absolutely brilliant. Thank you for such a comprehensive and succinct overview. One gets the feeling you may have done that before, but well done. Ketki, if I may turn to you, really putting on your hat, in a sense, as a banker, both with the IFC and now with Axis Bank and other roles you play. As Shloka alluded, one of the big themes in the lead up to the to COP26, during COP26 and definitely coming out, is the role of climate finance. There is both, of course, the question about who's going to pay for it, right? And the role of the West. There's a lot of acrimony about the $100 billion commitment that had been made by the West previously, that the developing countries would argue has not come close. And to the extent that it has come close, it's been in pledges as opposed to actual money flows. That has led many to also begin to ask questions about the role of multilateral banks, the role of venture capital, of different sources of capital for this. Could you give us just a very broad overview of how you think about the state of global climate finance at this point, and maybe where India fits into that equation?
Thank you, Irfan, and thank you for having me on this panel. I think let me start by delving into the numbers so you can get a sense of the magnitude we're talking about. These numbers, I've gotten these numbers from the Climate Policy Initiative, which is a very renowned global analysis and advisory organization on climate. And the numbers are really quite staggering. Global climate finance flows reached 632 billion in 2019-20, but are nowhere near enough to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. To meet global climate objectives by 2030, annual climate finance must reach $435 trillion, which is a 588% increase from what it is today. Nearly half this number, of 2.3 billion, is what is required by India alone to meet its 2030 targets to reach 500 gigawatts of renewable energy capacity, making it one of the most ambitious targets in the world. Green finance flows in India have averaged only 19 billion a year, leaving a huge financing gap of nearly 150 billion, which will have to be met to meet the 2030 targets announced by Prime Minister Modi. While domestic private investors have pledged 100 billion in renewable energy production, etc., foreign direct flows in this space have only been $1 billion. And as you said, most of it in pledges rather than actual flows. But when you think of the magnitude of what is required for us to meet our targets, it really does, it is incumbent, I think, on developed nations to be a huge part of this. India alone cannot generate this ambitious target. Our domestic markets, our budgets, etc., are very limited. We can't raise this money alone. It's really incumbent on countries like the US to come in here and provide this. I mean, I can talk later about what kinds of financing we can look at, but really it's a question of putting in some equity, long-term debt, which is not available in India for renewable capacity generation. These are serious gaps in the Indian market that need to be addressed. by developed economies and the multilateral institutions. So we're talking about, really a gap of an annual gap of 150 billion that needs to be met through external financing to help India reach its targets.
I appreciate that deep dive into the numbers, because the scale of this is really quite staggering. And we throw around numbers like millions and billions and trillions, and it's often hard to sort of fully appreciate that just what $1 trillion is.
Yeah.
Right? It's an absolutely insane amount of money. 1,000 billion, right, which itself is 1,000 million. I mean, so the scale of this should not be underestimated. And yet, turning to Matt, just really to get your take in this overview section of the conversation. The other part of this conversation that came up so prominently in Glasgow, and really maybe even more the reason for optimism than everything else we've talked about, is the role of technology and the role of innovation in driving this. From your role at the bank, your role now in private equity, what are you seeing on the US-India technology cooperation, or maybe even the global climate technology space that you think we should be paying attention to, that Indian businesses would be well advised to be paying attention to, maybe be early adopters to position themselves to be really competitive, as Shloka suggested they're going to have to be in the newer, greener, decarbon economy? Matt?
I appreciate it. Irfan, pleasure to be here and to be participating in this conversation. If I could, I'll get to that and answer that question, but I would like to take just a bit of a step back and really situate what's going on right now in the U.S.-India relationship in a broader context. And I mean two things by that. The first is that what's clearly happening around the world, some people are articulating it, some people aren't, is we're seeing a real competition between the U.S. and India's model of capitalism, more of a free market democratic capitalism, versus a state-led capitalist system that China and others have been promoting. Clearly, China has been quite effective in bringing people out of poverty. A lot of countries are looking to their model. Clearly, authoritarianism is on the rise. Again, people are looking to China and what it's been able to do, but other countries as well. And a lot of places and a lot of business people and others are looking towards which system is going to carry the day and what should they adopt as they move forward. I think that's really important for a second development, which is the Quad. The US, India, Japan, and Australia have come together in this group of four. And thus far, it's really been about security interests. But I think there's a huge opportunity to really focus on the economic opportunities of those four countries coming together. And I say that because if you think about the US and India, of course, are the world's two largest and oldest democracies, have very strong technology sectors, have great interchange on the educational side, on the business side. But historically, we've not invested as much in this relationship, I would argue, as we should have. And I think now is an opportunity, but it's especially important to realize that Japan and Australia are also coming together in this formal way with this bilateral relationship between the US and India. And we really ought to be articulating as business people and as thinkers in the space about how we can use the economic heft of those four countries to further our goals on sustainability and on investing in countries that need more energy to grow in particular. So I think that that's important because we ought to be framing it not just in a bilateral way, but thinking about that. And I say it because I recently was talking to a congressman here in the US who asked just for this. He said, how can we be doing a better job? How can the US Congress be thinking about the ways that the Quad can be more forceful from an economic standpoint? So because in the US Congress, at least, a lot of the discussion is framed around China versus the US, the Quad is something people are looking to. And as a result, I think there is money that could be had from the government side. There's all sorts of support that could be marshaled, and we ought to be thinking about it in those terms. In terms of technology that I would be paying attention to, I would say that hydrogen fusion technology is something that a lot of people are focused on. Now, I wonder why the US and India doesn't come together, pull together business people and do a hydrogen moonshot effort and think about how can we get this to be really practical and to be affordable and move it forward and really to partner up and think about pushing that forward, because that could solve an awful lot of the concerns that we raised at COP26, could be a complete game changer. And while there are individual companies that I'm aware of that are pushing on this path, there are investors that are quite interested, I haven't seen as much of a concerted push, and that might be one thing that we could think of. The other thing, because as business people, we all know, it comes down to what's the actual deal, what's the actual opportunity, what can people invest in. And I would say that having a vehicle that is really in line with COP26's goals is something that's hugely important. One thing that exists right now, as many people on this webinar would know, is something that the World Bank has called the Managed Co-Lending Portfolio Program, MCPP. And what that is essentially is an entity that has put, I think, $7, $8, $9 billion to work, so it can get much bigger. But what it essentially does is the IFC, which has done a very good job over time in infrastructure and building infrastructure, has a real commitment to doing it in the greenest ways possible. What it does is uses a first loss vehicle, soft money, that comes in, and by having first loss capital available, it increases the ratings of individual projects, which then allows insurance companies in particular to put money to work there because it reduces the risk. And that has been great. Swiss Re, Munich Re, very large investors who were not otherwise investing in emerging markets infrastructure now are because the ratings have changed. So one question I would have is, might we not pull people together and do an India-specific trust fund to help develop green infrastructure in India, since there are needs all over the place, which will really enhance the growth, the economic growth and development of India, but in a way that is targeted and is in line with a lot of the goals of COP26. I won't go into more detail there, but I just think we need some more of those kinds of ideas, specific opportunities, specific vehicles, some of which already exist, and then just really target them more effectively.
Thanks. And thank you, Matt. On the hydrogen economy, I would be remiss if I didn't point out that on Thursday, the Council is hosting a public webinar on the role of hydrogen in the clean transition. It's a bit of an awkward time for those of our friends who are based in Indian Standard Time, but hopefully it's still of interest to many on this call, because as Matt said, it's a huge area of opportunity. So you guys have done a tremendous job of just laying out.
And I should say, we did not plan this. So we didn't plan this. So that's great
to hear.
Great minds must think alike.
Well done. Yeah. So I want to sort of move to really a set of questions, and some of these have already begun to come in over the chat. One in particular early on is this entire question of making sure that in this broad, very big conversation, we think hard about the role of marginalized communities, making sure they have a voice and seat at the table, right? So that all these conversations aren't just happening in Glasgow and in Washington and in Davos, or indeed in Dubai or Delhi, but in fact, taking into account the billions of poorer people whose voices aren't represented often. So if we could just think of that as a meta theme to make sure that, as we think about the implications of this, what are the processes that include those voices, etc. But the question I have to get this going, and maybe I can take the liberty as moderator to ask Ketki first and then Shloka next to sort of respond to this question. I want to focus on India for a second. So the conversation around climate finance is very much, and correctly so, about how do we create the pool of capital that enables us to do the things we want. I think let's imagine that as a pipe of money that's coming in, but on the other end, that money has to go to places that it can be well used, can be applied correctly, etc. I think of this in terms of sort of the absorptive capacity of the country that it's entering, right? I mean, so that, and we know this in a very different context from a lot of research on foreign aid, for instance, that foreign aid gets used, for instance, better in some countries than in others. In some countries, it gets wasted, it's stolen, it's corrupt, all sorts of things. In other words, just sending money into a country is not a guarantee that is going to be used well. From a banking perspective, from a corporate absorption perspective, do we have the right ecosystem in place to absorb the kinds of dollar amounts, Ketki, that you were talking about? What if, in fact, suddenly that money was to come in? Where would it go? what would you advise the Indian government or Indian businesses to be thinking about so that they would be well placed to actually be competitive to receive that money, and if they got it, could actually do something good with it? Over to you.
So Irfan, that's a great question. You know, if you think about it, why hasn't that money come in so far, right? Some of the risks, you know, that prevent that money from coming in still exist today. This money would be going in large part to finance greenfield projects in renewable energy. Greenfield projects require, carry different risks from existing companies to which this money can go. And the some of the biggest risks, let me just outline a few of them. And they're big ones. And that's really, I think, if they're not addressed, I think, by the government, we will have a problem of having that pipeline sit outside and really not come in the magnitude that it should. In terms of renewable energy projects, land acquisition, still a big factor. Clear title to land doesn't exist today. It takes months, years really to get access to that. It's something we do need to think about, because there are, again, marginalized communities on some of this land, so they have to be resettled properly, etc. But it's a long drawn out process, right? So you have that as an issue. Then you have the state distribution companies, which are really antiquated, and the policy risks associated with these discoms who delay payments or renege on power purchase agreements is a huge risk. If you set up a project and you have a contract with a state distribution company that then reneges on a contract, that is a big risk. And we've got to get the government to make sure that these risks are taken away. Otherwise, this money is going to, as I said before, it will remain outside the country. People will hesitate to come in. Tariff policies on power, right? There should be an open market where green power is allowed to be sold rather than to an expensive grid, because that just makes it unviable. People will not consume it, people will steal it, and those losses are not just carried by distribution companies. Eventually, they're carried by the projects themselves. Availability of long-term debt. It's critical for any project to survive. Long-term debt there is a very shallow market for long-term debt in India. The domestic bond market is practically non-existent. And I think it's the kinds of things that David was talking about, where you have to have a multilateral come in, provide a first loss vehicle so that insurance companies, which are sitting on lots of patient long-term capital, they can invest in these, and these projects can then get off the ground. There should be opportunities for rupee financing to be raised abroad in what is called masala bonds. Green masala bonds is another way. So unless the government comes together, puts a really cohesive policy together on removing these obstacles, I think that pipeline of money you're talking about, Irfan, is not going to come in. It will be a trickle. So
thanks for the sobering analysis. I agree with you completely. And I think it's worth remembering that in this climate finance question, especially when we start thinking about private financing, there are a lot of other options for where the money could go, right? I mean, India is an extremely attractive market, if not only for its size, but also for the talent and human capital and all of that that India possesses. But investors need to make sure that their money is safe, that it has a return, and if they can find a better set of options elsewhere, they'll go there. And so we are in a competition in that regard, for sure. I think you meant Matt, not David, Ketki, but the point about the first loss.
Did I say? I'm sorry. I thought I said
don't worry about it. Shilka, would you agree with what Ketki's analysis of sort of the danger of this being a trickle if we don't get the right system? What would be on your wish list for shoring up the policy ecosystem so that we can be competing as Indian businesses, as Indian civil society, for the climate finance once it's available?
No, thanks for that, Irfan. And I thought, I mean, Ketki is right. There is reason to be, very concerned. And I'll sort of give you my wish list. But before I do, I also wanted to quickly address one of the questions that you mentioned about sort of civil society not being represented. And actually, I do want to say that one of the things that was really distinct about this COP again was the significant contribution by non-state actors. So, both the private sector, of course, but also the philanthropic sector that really missed out on the spotlight. And this year we saw international philanthropies, 17 funders, pooled in together with governments to invest 1.7 billion USD towards indigenous communities as part of the global pledge to end deforestation. So there is very much representation that's taking place. Perhaps it's not grabbing the headlines, but civil society, and as I said, philanthropy is very much involved, more so than ever before. To your question specifically, Irfan, since January 2020, just over 440 million USD has trickled into the Indian climate and clean tech startup space by way of early stage funding. So Ketki's right, because that's a fraction of the 40 billion USD in global investments in this space in that same 18-month period. So it goes without saying that government reforms are really the need of the hour. We do need to build out steps to resuscitate the indebted power utilities, like Ketki was saying, and hopefully that in turn will improve the appeal of clean power producers. But there's a more powerful antidote that I do want to talk about, which is what consumers want. So for instance, as batteries become cheaper, people will generate their own energy from rooftop solar, store it in their batteries. They will run it in their vehicles during the day and use it at home at night. Suddenly, the utilities hold over users is not what it used to be. So deepening local demand for climate-friendly alternatives is the big first step in winning the climate battle, and global private capital will follow. Further, India does need to send out clear policy signals. As I mentioned at the start, we do need to look at short-term decarbonization targets for a 10-year window, such as 2020 to 2030, as part of our updated NDCs. It could be 2030 to 2040 or so on until 2070, really. India needs financing of the order of 600 billion alone for meeting its 2030 renewable energy targets of 500 gigawatts. So really, for this, we have to create an investor-friendly environment. It's absolutely essential. And earlier this year, Prime Minister Modi announced the launch of the Joint Climate and Clean Energy Initiative with the US to mobilize investments, to demonstrate clean technologies, and to enable green collaborations. And India could also, in that, create templates of sustainable development for other developing countries. So this India-US, climate and clean energy agenda partnership really will strengthen bilateral collaboration across climate and clean energy. And given our very ambitious mitigation targets, we need to speed up, we need to scale innovative clean technologies. You mentioned this at the start. We have to decarbonize sectors, especially for the hard to abate sectors like steel and cement, transportation, power, and of course, buildings. India also needs financial and technological support and capacity to measure, manage, and adapt to the risks of increasing climate-related impacts, especially for its most vulnerable first responders of climate change. And we have to ensure a just transition as well. So to sum up, the way we see it at the ICC is really that there's an incredible amount of diversity in the investments we can take towards a green economy. And we're working to make sure that funders have the access to the right kind of solutions and the solutions they want to fund. And this applies not only to domestic and international philanthropy, of course, but also to other pools of finance in this space. So we're talking about corporates and corporate sustainability, carbon finance, impact finance, amongst a whole host of other pools of capital. So we work to curate these kind of opportunities, and we work closely both with our network of donors and partners to ensure that we put forward high impact solutions and increase their likelihood of getting funded. But as I said, that's a small piece of the puzzle.
Well, the puzzle is only complete with all those small pieces. So we appreciate you pointing out that picture. I do want to acknowledge that Vikas Jambukar is the person who asked the question about the civil society. So I appreciate you answering that head on as well. We have another question in the chat that maybe I can just keep you on for a second, Shloka. Geeta Jadhav asked this question about, as technology, we talk about sustainability, etc. There is, of course, a concern that the middle class in particular will face higher costs for goods that are critical to their lives, right? We already have inflation as a concern around the world. On the one hand, you're absolutely right that as these technologies get onboarded and mainstreamed, consumers will have a lot more choices. And with that, over time, one imagines that prices will level out and all of that. But in the short term, one could imagine some pain, right? Electric vehicles have taken a while to become affordable before they were just luxury kind of vehicles. What do you think is the likely prospect for inflationary pressure from all these new commitments you're making? Sorry,
I just realized I was on mute. Look, it's a great question. I mean, in recent past, like technological innovation has actually reduced the physical cost of building the components for solar energy generation plants. Financial innovation has allowed us to front load the cost of these plants to be adjusted for. And political leadership has ensured that these plants were integrated into the legacy power network. We are going to require all three to materialize within this decade. That's technological innovation, financial innovation, and political leadership to ensure that we are shaping a future, as you rightly said, that sort of integrates these costs into transitioning to a green economy. Because of these three, India today has the lowest per unit installation cost of renewable energy in the world. And as you rightly pointed out, as we look or seek to restructure our mobility sector, land use, our cities in keeping with this new green development paradigm, there is an opportunity to sort of demonstrate global leadership and to create those templates, as I said, for other emerging economies to follow. But it is going to need to be done together. There is no question that these are challenges that are tremendous. There are development aspirations to keep in mind along with the climate crisis. But all I'm positioning or trying to sort of put forward here is that they don't have to come at the cost of each other. If we manage this, as I said, by looking at all three pieces of that paradigm. It's difficult, but it's not impossible.
Thank you. Matt, if I could bring you back in, and then Ketki, you'll be on deck because I want your perspective on this question as well. But Matt, I love the point you made about the strategic opportunities from the Quad, especially in this space. One way to be a little provocative over here, though, is to suggest that India is quite different in terms of its economy than the other three, right? It is the only one of the three that's clearly still a developing economy, even if it's developing quickly. But it's also one in which the private sector is really made up of a lot more small and medium enterprises, even micro enterprises, than is true of the larger, more developed industrial economies. From a venture capital, private equity perspective, what do those MSMEs need to do in order to be part of this conversation in terms of climate finance, in terms of technology transfer and adoption? Or do they run the risk of, you've got a lot of really big world-beating champions coming out of India. They drive this energy conversation. They're the ones who sort of have the ability to absorb new technology, to absorb new capital, and it leaves smaller businesses really further behind because they don't have that ability to just pivot, to transition, etc. One could argue, of course, that maybe they're more nimble, but how do we make sure that that large group of smaller companies in the Indian context also compete for all of this capital and technologies that we're talking about? Any thoughts on this?
Sure. And first, on the Quad, I think the fact that India is still more of a developing economy is actually a huge asset for that Quad relationship, because as you think about the four countries coming together to work on anything, it provides credibility for a lot of the world to know that India is part of it and has a perspective that is perhaps closer to that of many other countries around the world. So I think it's quite an asset and is important. And the US, Japan, and Australia can learn an awful lot by listening to India's experience and understanding what exactly India requires to move forward in the direction that it wants to move. I think the important thing to think about in terms of those medium, small-sized businesses is that not all of them need equity. It's really debt financing that often that they need, right? It's access to credit to really grow what their businesses and do what they need to do. So sometimes people talk very quickly about venture and about private equity because it's sexy and so much money is made there. But the truth is, I would argue, it's really about just access to credit, so that people can actually grow when they need to, build another plant, expand their distribution. People often don't want to give up big chunks of their company, and they often don't need to have equity injections. They really just need access to solid and consistent, bank lending and credit of various sorts. And then to answer your question about what do those companies need to do to be able to compete, I don't have a great answer. I have not spent enough time in India really working with some of those companies. I've worked with some of the larger companies in India when I was at the U.S. Commerce Department, and clearly have a sense of some of those. But I wouldn't want to venture down a path that I'm not really as well versed on as some others might be on this call.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I think you're probably being too humble on that, but that's fine. Ketki, what about you? From the perspective of someone who's been very deeply involved in the Indian banking sector, how do we think about the smaller companies and smaller firms as being part of this broader conversation? And second, one of the questions asked in the Q&A is, we talk a lot about money going to corporates, right, in this, but a large part of the technology innovation is going to happen because someone's willing to take a bet on startups, right, on the brilliant engineer who doesn't have a track record, et cetera. Do we have that ecosystem? Is that emerging? Is there reason for optimism in that front? Or are we really in a tech transfer system where the technology comes from the West as opposed to being developed indigenously?
So in fact, both Matt and Shloka made some really great points. Matt, I completely agree with you, and it's Matt, that MSMEs really require access to credit in order to grow. It's not equity. And there's clearly not enough coming from the banking system. I mean, we have a host of non-bank financial companies that have sprung up to try and fill in that gap. But having said that, I think Shloka's point about rooftop solar, that's going to be the paradigm shift for smaller companies, is actually getting, that space is an important one. In fact, I sit on the investment committee of a fund in the US that is actually funding non-bank financial institutions in India that support MSME solar. So these are the kinds of things that we need to scale up in order for MSMEs to be part of this conversation. Irfan, in terms of technology, India has. I mean, I'll just give you one example. I'm not an expert on this subject, but solar panels. We were importing solar panels from China previously, right? Now we're making them in India. So clearly, technology has shifted. There are players now that are they don't want to be vulnerable to Chinese imports, and they have started producing these panels indigenously. The question is, do we have any government support or subsidies to help that happen? I haven't seen that yet, but it's really MSMEs, solar rooftop, getting capital to finance NBFCs that may support solar rooftop financing. That will really change the game for the smaller players.
That's very helpful. Shloka, so all of this is, I appreciate everyone being extremely positive and constructive in their comments. One of our commentators, actually several of them, are a little more focused on the short term than on even the medium and long term. And if we think about just the next few years, what do we need to do to just get this on track, right? I mean, so one of the viewers, Surinder Kalra, asked a very pointed question that frankly is on my mind as well, which is, on the same time that we're talking about COP26 and we're talking about these bold commitments, we are faced with these terrible images of Delhi choking and its own pollution. Now, these are not the same things. Climate change is not pollution, etc. But it does beg the question of, does a society, does a government that has shown very little ability to deal with something so immediate actually have the wherewithal to tackle commitments made well into the future, right? I mean, it's in some sense to talk about 2070 is a lot easier than to talk about 2022, right, in a sense. So just to be really, to push the point, as we begin to wrap up over here, what are the markers of tangible progress that you would be looking for that you think India, the United States, and other governments over here should be putting on their board in the coming months, in the coming years, so that we have a reason to actually believe that the longer term commitments are sincere, not just talking points?
Great question. It's a difficult one to answer, but I'll try to do my best. I think the reason I'm optimistic, if not always hopeful, if that makes sense, is that India does need to decarbonize to keep our industries competitive with global markets. And I think it's a really good conduit into understanding climate action as development, right? It's a pathway to a cleaner future with better quantity and quality of jobs. It means more resilient agriculture. It means a more equitable society. So I don't think it's really a question of if, it's a matter of when, and can we do it quickly enough and in time. I also want to point out that while India is the world's third largest emitting country, scale also matters because our emissions are roughly half of the USA's, which is the second largest emitter, and the USA's are roughly half of China's, which is the world's largest emitter. But while we have historically emitted, far less, it is obviously going to rise as we go forward, and I think that is definitely a point of concern and something that we have to obviously move forward quickly on. I think some of the areas that I would point to is, definitely a need to mobilize investments in green recovery. As I said, there was an inclination that our central government showed towards the green recovery in its last stimulus. And it's really critical, as I said, to bridge that gap between where funding is required and what solutions exist on the ground. You've mentioned the MSME sector. I think that's one of the sectors that's primed for a transition. We're also looking at agroforestry, sustainable cold chains. These are all massive opportunities to really build in catalytic, impactful solutions and change and transition at scale. I think some of the other pieces that we're really focused on and need to focus on as a country is enabling a just transition. So we've talked in India about the need to triple renewable capacity in under a decade. The phase down on coal power. It's essential to protect those 4 million workers and the significant government revenues that depend on this sector as well. It's not sort of as easy as shutting down coal plants and moving straight into sort of renewable energy. There is, as I said, a transition that we have to manage, and nations such as ours do need to be supported as they move through this transition. You are looking at affected populations. There are potentially huge risks to these transitions, but we have to enable the creation of these roadmaps, and that's really the work of the present. Another key thing that I think we have to focus on is adapting to climate impacts. We didn't really have enough of a conversation around adaptation at this COP. So in addition to reducing emissions, we do have to equip vulnerable regions and populations. The air pollution you've mentioned is such a critical piece, or actually manifestation really of the climate issue, right? How do we prepare regions and populations to be more resilient to climate shocks? The government is already doing this kind of work, but they need support in terms both of reach through civil society, which by the way is another really important role for them, and of course through funding. So a good example is NABARD, which teamed up with the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation and the government of Maharashtra to equip communities in climate vulnerable districts of Ahmednagar, they provided them with knowledge, with strategies, with approaches for adaptation across water, agriculture, and energy. So these are the kind of projects that we have to promote. And the other one that I would mention is the need to transition heavy industries. So emissions heavy industries like steel and cement, they form the basis of the modern world, but they are notoriously hard to decarbonize. And this is really relevant for India because our manufacturing sector is really set to expand under the Atmanirbhar Bharat initiative. And while the technologies required to transition the sector to low carbon processes are available, they're nowhere near affordable yet. So again, in the short term, we have to play a role, the funder, the finance community in accelerating this transition. We have to be able to figure out how to support governments, the largest consumers of industrial material, to really procure clean alternatives. And that's a lot of, convening across different ecosystems, bringing stakeholders together, funding demand side measures that can help in the uptake of low emission technologies. And that, of course, reduces prices as they scale to maturity. So really, it's difficult to see action on the scale and timeframes we've identified without the support of a whole host of ecosystem actors and players. And that's really, as I said, the work of right now. We're really hoping that in the next COP, you see a lot of Indian funders make their voices heard alongside their international and corporate counterparts as well.
Well, thank you, Shloka. That was absolutely fabulous. Ketki, in the couple of minutes we have left, I have a question for you and then one for Matt. For you, you straddle Bombay and Washington in your life, both professionally and personally. You also occupy this rarefied air of, the people who are making the decisions of climate, of finance, right, in the banking sector, both at IFC and now at Axis Bank. We've talked a lot about the recipients, of the potential recipients of this financing. What do you think needs to change on the mindset of the bankers and how they approach a lot of this? We hear so much about de-risking and the need to de-risk, etc. But is that a genuine risk, or is this really outmoded sort of conservatism of the banking sector that needs to sort of, in some sense, get with the times and realize that the moment is now, that the same urgency we need from corporates and from civil society, from government, also needs to be seen from the people who have, in some sense, control of the money? So a very loaded question, but maybe in a minute, a quick take on that.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Irfan. And, as someone who has spent 25 years at the World Bank IFC, I mean, I've lived and breathed ESG. It's about, the word impact financing is being bandied about a lot, right? I mean, we never at the IFC did anything that did not meet ESG goals. So we've done that kind of impact for a long time. It's time that the banking sector in India adopted the same thing. I was telling Shloka earlier offline that ESG is a movement in India today. Nobody wants to be the leader. Everybody is waiting for the regulator, okay, to take the lead on this. No bank wants to be the first to do this. I mean, I've sat on Axis Bank's board for a long time. We finally put together an ESG committee of the board to incorporate IFC performance standards in our lending. Okay, it's going to take some time, but it's begun. It's begun. I think the regulator has also started talking about incorporating ESG in lending practices for banks. Let's hope it's sooner rather than later, Irfan. There's a lot of talk, not much action. We've started in a small way at Axis. ICICI Bank has also started. Let's hope it translates into regulatory policy as well, so that it keeps the banks honest in doing ESG lending.
Absolutely, thank you, Matt. Welcome back. You get to have the last word. We are out of time, but I did want to ask: the Biden administration is in the process of, passing pretty huge, transformative legislative agenda that focuses on infrastructure that has a large part of this. In the US, you have a progressive wing of the legislators who have been arguing for the Green New Deal, et cetera. Just from your perch in the US, what should Indian businesses be looking for in terms of US leadership on these issues? If you could just take a quick minute to give us a sense, and then I'll wrap up.
I would say I would actually focus less on, if I were an Indian business person, I would focus less on the US government and more on US businesses, and really identifying opportunities to work with them, whether it's through finance or on the technology side or on individual projects, whatever it might be. I think the government, whether it's the Biden administration or Congress, will go where the businesses go. And if businesses start really partnering in novel ways and start doing bold things, I think there will be a lot of support that will come behind it. I think to the point that Shloka made earlier and some questions that we've gotten, time is just short. And I think if we wait for government, no matter how progressive it is or how assertive it is, we don't have time. This is too critical an issue, and we just have to move as the business community, and governments will come along where and how they can.
The perfect words on which to end. And if that business to business collaboration is going to occur, it's going to be thanks to the joint efforts of people like you, but also our friends at the Confederation of Indian Industry, and definitely of the US Consulate in Bombay, as well as other consulates and the embassy in Delhi that have worked so hard to facilitate that, as well as, of course, their Indian counterparts here in the United States. On behalf of my colleagues at the South Asia Center, the Atlantic Council of CII and the US Consulate, allow me to just thank Ketki, Shloka, and Matt for giving us their time, but really just a brilliant set of insights. Thank you for the over 200 of you who joined and stayed through this call. We appreciate your commitment to these issues, and hope you will stay engaged with us as we try and figure out how to get some of these great ideas into action and practice. We have a lot to learn from you, and we look forward to that conversation. Thank you, everyone. Be well, stay safe.
Thanks, Irfan.
Thank you. Thanks, Irfan.
Thank you.
Thanks, Matt.
Yeah.
Thanks, Stacey.
Yeah, you too, Shloka and Matt. Bye.
Thank you all. Pleasure. Take care.